So we've still got a couple people trickling in. I think I'm gonna just start talking about the agenda. Once I switch to demos, it's gonna be harder for me to let people in, but I'll try and remember every couple minutes to check if there's anyone who wants to be admitted and let them in. So my basic plan today, first of all, the thing I most want to do is hear questions from folks. I think some people came in with some questions prepared, and I think that'll be really interesting. I'm not totally sure about everyone's background, so I'm going to try and do some like fairly quick demos of accessibility features in the Desmos calculators. But I'm hoping to drive things by people's questions because that'll make things a lot more interesting. So my rough plan, we're going to take a look at the Desmos scientific calculator and how to use screen readers when reading and editing equations, and then also how to use Braille, including with a refreshable Braille display. So we'll take a look at that in the scientific calculator. I know there were some questions about mobile, Apple iOS, so I'll pause and we can discuss those maybe after we take a quick look at the scientific calculator. And then I will also show a couple of things in the graphing calculator. So we'll talk about audio representations of graphs and options for tactile graphics. That's the plan. I think I'll just go ahead and dive into that unless, I don't know, any more advice you want to give me, Susan? Oh, Susan, sorry, I think you're muted.
I got to unmute myself. Okay. No, I think you've got a great plan. And if people will just put questions into the chat. Do you want me to alert you, Jason, or will one of your people alert you if they see something, or what would you?
Oh yeah, you know what? I think that would be a great way to organize things. If you have questions like while I'm in the middle of talking, maybe put them in the chat and we'll make Susan be the chat moderator and she can let me know if there's questions. I'm also going to pause at some points and just open up the floor for folks who want to ask their questions directly. And so should be a mute button down in the bottom left of your screen that you can use to unmute yourself. I'm going to ask folks to mostly stay muted, but if you have a question, either put it in the chat or feel free to hop in. So I'm going to go ahead and turn on screen share. And can everyone see my screen here, Desmos.com? Can someone give me a thumbs up? Susan, you can see my screen?
Yes.
Okay,
yes,
awesome.
Right. I keep muting and unmuting. Okay.
So I guess there's probably a range of amounts of familiarity with Desmos and these tools. So everything I'm going to show today, freely available from Desmos.com, so you can start here. We're going to take a look at the scientific calculator first, which we can get to from here. The graphing calculator, second thing we'll look at is this big red button. And then I will also talk through a little bit of the accessibility documentation, which explains how to use things with particular devices and screen readers and operating systems and all of that. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with the scientific calculator. The main idea here is basic calculations. So things like 1 + 1, we can see our answer to. I'm going to turn on projector mode here. Just makes things, everything a little bit bigger. Can be useful if you're at the front of the classroom, or some low vision folks find this feature helpful to make things a little bit bigger. One moment, I'm going to pause and see if I can let in. I think we have a couple new participants who are waiting for me. Okay. Oh, maybe I was wrong about that.
Jason, could you just show that projector button again? You did it so quick, I don't see how you did it.
Oh, yeah. So it's
okay,
this bench icon over here on the right, and then projector mode. Okay, so I am on Mac OS here today. So I'm going to use the VoiceOver screen reader that comes built in with my operating system. But Desmos is designed to work with all of the popular screen readers. So if you're on Windows, you can also use NVDA or JAWS. So I'm going to go ahead and turn on my screen reader.
Navigation. Desmos. 1 plus 1 plus 1.
All right, so I've got VoiceOver on here, and now as I type, the screen reader will read about what I'm typing and also tell me answers to anything I type.
1 plus 1. 1 plus 1 equals 2.
So that's the basic use of the screen reader. Reads out what I typed, reads out the answer, and if I select part of the equation, I can also hear some context about where I am. So if I maybe make this 1 plus a half.
Over 2. 1 plus start fraction, 1 over 2, and fraction equals 1.5.
So we hear a little bit of how it reads fractions, and then if I move the cursor around, I'll also hear some information about where I am.
2. Before start fraction, 1 over 2, and fraction.
Yeah, when we move before the fraction, we hear about that. In the Desmos calculator, you can have as many expressions or as many calculations as you want.
Expression 2.
You can also refer to previous answers using ANS. So if we want to do 150% of the previous answer, we can do
150% of 100 s 150% of n equals 2.25.
All right, so 150% of the previous answer, which is 1.5, is 2.25. So this is the basic use of the scientific calculator with screen readers. Let me pause here and see if there's any questions that have come up about screen reader support for reading and writing equations.
Zoom.us, system dialog, mute. Zoom meeting, chat. Chat list, embedded, paragraph separator, Zoom group chat, to everyone.
Okay, great. No questions in the chat so far.
Dock to top, you are screen sharing.
So there's a lot more we could say about screen reader support for equations, but I think I'll go ahead and move on to Braille, and if folks have any questions, feel free to bring them up. So I'm going to turn off my screen reader for a moment to talk about Braille.
VoiceOver off.
I'm also just going to go ahead and clear out this example. So I think screen readers are extremely helpful for reading content on the web, but especially for mathematics, it can be really useful to have symbolic notation also. I think sighted mathematicians have developed a really specialized way of writing math that helps them think about things symbolically and concisely. And for exactly the same reason, people who read Braille have developed really nice symbolic notations for math. And so we want to make those available to students in their math classrooms. So to do that, over in this same settings menu that we use to turn on projector mode, we can also switch into a Braille mode. So you can choose between Nemeth and UEB. Actually, I'm going to type something in visual notation first before I do this. So we can switch into Nemeth here and notice that the calculator has automatically translated what I wrote in visual notation into Nemeth Braille. I think this is kind of fun. Braille has been kind of a learning journey for me over the last few years, and it's helped me learn some of this notation to be able to write something in visual notation, switch to Braille, and then find out about notations that way. We can also translate into UEB, another way of writing Braille mathematics. I'm mostly going to focus on Nemeth today, but if people have any questions about UEB, happy to answer them. One more thing here. So we envision that this will usually be used with a refreshable Braille display. And so you can hook that up like with USB or Bluetooth. And so for people who actually want to read Braille, that will allow them to read the Braille on the dynamic Braille display. And a lot of them have Perkins style input or a QWERTY keyboard. But for me, since I'm a sighted mathematician, I like to use my QWERTY keyboard, but it makes the most sense to me to write Braille using the Perkins style. So I'm going to switch on 6-key Braille. We've heard from a lot of TBIs that this is useful to them also. And what this lets you do is use SDF and JKL on your QWERTY keyboard as if it was a Perkins input. So now that I'm in Braille mode here, I'm going to go ahead and start a new expression. And so since I turned on 6-key input, I can do the Perkins style input. So I'm going to do the numeric indicator. That's 3, 4, 5, 6. So I'll be pressing the S and JKL keys. So that gets me 1 cell, and then I can do 2 plus 2. And on the refreshable Braille display, I'll be seeing down on the cells, the thing I'm editing. I can use the routing keys to move my cursor around. If I want to go to the answer, I can press tab, and that will move me over to the answer field. And then I will see the answer pop up on the refreshable Braille display, and I can tab back to edit. And we've tried to make all this work as well as possible for collaborating between sighted people and people who are reading Braille. So that might be a sighted teacher or TVI working with a student, or a student working with one of their peers. And so in order to do that, we show SymBraille, so you can see the Braille, like a sighted person can easily see the Braille that someone's writing on a refreshable Braille display. We also show the visual math notation, and we make it easy to switch back and forth. So maybe I want to write something like square root of 2, and I'll do that in the visual notation. And then I can switch back into Nemeth, and we can see that the square root notation looks like this in Braille. So let me pause there and ask again for any questions about reading and writing Braille with a refreshable Braille display in the calculator.
I have one about how that looks on the refreshable Braille. What I'm looking at visually has a big old space between the expression and the answer. On my display, will my answer be over on the far right, or will all those blank spaces be lifted out so that I have a nice, concise equation?
So the thing we've done that we have found makes it easiest to edit is that we don't show the answer at the same time that you're editing the thing that you're typing. So you'll press the tab key, which it's going to vary depending on the Braille display, but like every Braille display has a way to move from one field to the next. So when you're editing, you only see the thing that you're editing. And then when you want to see the answer, you press tab, and that moves you over to the answer, and then you only see the answer on the Braille display.
That's very similar to the way a lot of graphing calculators will put the expression on one line and the answer on the next.
Yeah.
Thank you.
One other thing I'll mention, actually, let me pause for one more second just to see if there's any more questions here.
Jason, just a comment, and it's not related to the Braille necessarily, but when you were not using the Braille part, you didn't have to tab through all of those buttons. There were things like just SQRT for writing square root and
oh, yeah.
That, right?
So when you're doing visual math notation, we do have this keypad here that makes it so you can use the calculator on a touch screen without an external keyboard. I think it's also a nice way to discover different notations and what's possible in the calculator. But we've designed this so you can do everything from your keyboard. You shouldn't ever have to use anything that's down in this keypad. And so for folks who are using a screen reader, we really encourage learning how to input things with the keyboard because it's just so much faster. So as Sarah mentioned, I can type SQRT, for example, to get a square root button. And that means I don't have to move my mouse down here and find the square root key. And I'll show you, we have some documentation that lists all the keyboard shortcuts, so I'll show where to find that in a minute.
Jason, you have a question from Lynn in the chat?
All right, let's take a look at the chat. So Lynn asks, when using a refreshable Braille display, how to connect to Desmos. So you can connect the refreshable Braille display to your computer the same way you would for any other program. The refreshable Braille display I use the most has both a USB connector or Bluetooth. I use Bluetooth because it's convenient, no wires, but you can also use USB if you want. And then you use a web browser, or you can use apps. We have apps for Android and iOS. So all of this also works just as well on iOS. In fact, I find it a little easier to use my refreshable Braille display with iOS, to be honest, although it works fine on the Mac. So you just navigate your browser to desmos.com/scientific, and then you can type in, once you're in Braille mode, the same way you would on any other website, with a couple caveats. So let me just pause and talk about this right now. So I'm back at our homepage. I'm going to go down to Resources Accessibility. And this is where we document everything you need to know to use assistive technology with Desmos, desmos.com/accessibility. And so there's some instructions here that are like per OS and per screen reader that are important to see for using a refreshable Braille display. So I'm just going to find Braille here. So this is one example of setting up, I think this is JAWS for Braille. And there's a thing that I wish you didn't have to think about that you do have to think about, and it's what translation table you're using. So when you're writing text, you're probably, if you're a fluent reader and writer of Braille, going to be wanting to use like grade 2 Braille with contractions. Unfortunately, this interferes with writing Nemeth equations, because some of those same contractions that mean one thing in UEB mean a different thing when you're writing math in Nemeth. So for each screen reader, we have instructions about how to put your screen reader into, a lot of times it's going to be called like computer Braille or 8-dot Braille. There's a mode that's going to mean don't do any contractions and output the cells as I write them immediately to the page. And to have a good experience, it's really important to turn that on. I wish we could just turn this on automatically, but that's probably the biggest caveat or like hurdle you're gonna hit, is that no one loves configuring screen readers. But if you don't do that, this is not gonna work well. So you will have to take a look at the accessibility documentation, figure out how to get yourself into 8-dot or computer Braille. And that's gonna let you be successful with a refreshable Braille display. Since we have Steve on the line, I wonder if Steve has any more comments he wants to share about that, because it's a really important issue.
Yeah, so it's certainly not an ideal set of circumstances, but with a web page, you know, this is one of those things where, for very obvious security reasons, we can't just reach into your computer and change your screen reader settings for you. Even if that were possible, I would probably not advocate for that unless the user wanted it. But yeah, it's not too bad. Most the instructions that we have on our page cover all of the major products and how to get them into this mode, you know, with as much device agnosticity as possible. The good news, at least, is that the majority of these screen readers and Braille displays have very convenient key commands that you can just press on the display to, you know, turn that 8-dot mode on or off. And when it's back off, it goes back to grade 2. So it's something to be aware of. But once you know how to kind of get in and out of that mode, it's really not too bad.
Anyone have any more questions about this? Because it's subtle and important. Anyone have any criticisms about this? I wonder if there's any system who does this better than we do that someone wants to tell me about, because we're always trying to learn and make this stuff easier to use. And this is something that's been on my mind for quite a while.
My real problem is not one that, it's not a problem with Desmos. I love this calculator, but oftentimes I want to start teaching my students on calculators when they don't have the facility with screen readers. You know, and while I can certainly teach them the calculator, and I can even teach them the accessibility portions of the calculator, I can't teach them the screen reader stuff. And I feel like I have to then learn how to do, I'm not a TVI, by the way. I just teach math at the Texas School for the Blind. So I have a lot of other folk around me who can teach them screen readers, but my students frequently don't know how to use the screen reader well enough for me to then be able to get them to use Desmos.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
I'm curious, are these Braille readers, or are they primarily just using the speech aspect?
I have a mix.
Okay.
I'm primarily using, for my scientific and graphing calculators, the Orbit Orion stuff at the moment, because I don't have to teach some other piece of tech. It's a self-standing piece that I can use for my entire class simultaneously. But I would love to just shift straight on over to Desmos. I just can't do it yet.
Yeah, and it's possible that depending on the screen reader in use, that somebody could write like a configuration file or a script or something that would, you know, just put you into this mode when you're on a web page that happens to be one of the Desmos calculators. That's not something that we've done, but it could be done.
Oh, sorry. I have the same problem as Scott, that my students, it's adding another layer of complexity. Also, the number, I'm trying to think, like, maybe I could get all of my students an iPad, but they don't all have computers. So that's the other issue that I have.
Yeah, I mean, I think these are really important issues. I think a lot of people, like, the right solution to this is going to depend on your circumstances, what you have access to, who the student is, what their abilities and interests are. So, like, there's a lot of different answers to these questions. One thing that I still think, like, a talking four-function calculator, the sort of the simplest talking calculator you can get, I still think that's going to have a lot of value for people, no matter how good a job Desmos does making a web calculator. I do think we can add a lot of value as students get ready for more complex math. So when you start working with a scientific calculator or a graphing calculator, I think we're able to do some things that make life a lot easier for students than they used to be on the standalone devices. So yeah, there's some interesting trade-offs about when you might want to switch from a handheld talking calculator to something that runs on the web. I also think, like, more and more developing screen reader skills is going to be a really important life skill for all of these students. And similarly, figuring out how to get access to technology. Like, I know there's constraints about, like, sometimes you just don't have the device and there's no resources to get it. And I'm, you know, that's not always something that we have control over. But I also think, like, so many students are going to have a smartphone at some point in their life that's going to be a really, really important piece of technology for life skills, like for getting directions to get around a city or figuring out where they want to go eat or something like that. And so, like, finding out if a student has a device, Desmos cares a lot about making sure that our tools run on that device. So we have apps for smartphones, and we've thought about how do you hook up a Bluetooth keyboard or hook up a refreshable Braille display over Bluetooth to a smartphone. Again, yeah, I use my refreshable Braille display with my iPhone, and it's great. So yeah, I don't have a perfect answer to this question, but I do think, like, more and more students are going to be using technology as part of their regular life, and so figuring out how to take that same technology and make it part of their math life is something we think is important.
So if they have the smartphone and we could put Desmos on it, they can, with their refreshable Braille device, then they could access Desmos that way?
Yeah, absolutely. So if they have a smartphone, like say it's an iPhone, then they can go to the App Store and download the Desmos app. And there's an app for the scientific calculator or an app for the graphing calculator. The phone has voiceover. It's, I think, really good. I mean, I know probably there's a lot to complain about it too, but I think Apple's done a pretty nice job with voiceover on iOS, and the refreshable Braille display should be able to connect to that over Bluetooth. So yeah, I've had the best experiences that I've had with my refreshable Braille display have been using it with my phone on iOS.
Oh, good. Well, I mean, most of my kids have the smartphones, and some have, I don't know, it's just getting all the equipment to make this work.
Yeah.
How well does the phone app accept voice input? In other words, could I speak an expression or an equation in?
That's not something that I've spent much time on. I think it's possible, but I don't know. It's probably not perfect. So that's something I'll probably be thinking about more over the years. But I don't know. Give it a try and let us know how it goes. Also, I see from the chat, Craig Edgley says, "Is there a way to audio trace on the iPhone?" Okay, so if you only have an iPhone, we'll talk about audio trace in a second, but I just want to answer this question now. So the answer is no, but. So if you only have your iPhone with the touch screen, audio trace requires a lot of keyboard commands to work right now. We're thinking about how to improve this in the future, but it doesn't work great if you're just using the touch screen. What you can do is hook a Bluetooth keyboard up to your phone and use audio trace that way, or hook a Bluetooth keypad up to your iPad. And that works great, again, like just as well as on my computer or better. So that's a recommendation for now. I hope we'll be able to make it work better with only touchscreen in the future, because no one wants to carry more devices with them than they have to. But if you can get access to an external keyboard, that'll make things work really well on the mobile devices.
One thing I also want to add real quick about that, since we've been talking so much about Braille, is that in the latest versions of iOS, the Braille commands have been greatly expanded, including being able to issue typical, commands that you could only previously do from a keyboard. So you could do the commands to turn audio trace on and off, and even move around it if you've got a Braille display. And you can even customize those Braille commands to, do specific actions based on, whatever keys you have available to you.
So I think at this point I want to move on and talk a little bit about some things in the graphing calculator. But yeah, again, really appreciate the questions, and I will leave plenty of additional time for more questions after I show a couple things about audio trace and tactile graphics. So I'm going to hop over back to the Desmos homepage and click this big Start Graphing button to get us to the graphing calculator. And this is also available, desmos.com/calculator. If you're looking in the app stores, this is the graphing calculator app. The scientific calculator we're just looking at is the Desmos scientific calculator app. So we try and have lots of easy ways to access this on the web or on your mobile devices. I'm going to go ahead and turn my screen reader back on.
Voiceover on Chrome. Expression 1.
And so the screen reader support for reading and writing equations works in the graphing calculator just the same as it did in the scientific calculator. But now we can graph things. So I'm going to go ahead and write y equals x.
Y equals x. Y equals x as graph. To audio trace, press Option plus T.
All right, so as soon as I've typed something that can graph, my screen reader tells me there is a graph, tells me how to enter audio trace.
Zoom.us, system dialog, button.
I forgot to, I'm gonna
Graph
turn on
settings.
projector mode
Projector
here too.
mode selected. Graph set at y equals x.
All right, so now when I'm on y equals x, I'm gonna go ahead and turn on what we call audio trace. And this will give me a couple of options for getting audio representations of this graph.
Audio trace on. Use arrow keys to navigate. To hear the graph, press H to disable audio trace. Press Option plus T.
All right, so it gave us some instructions about how to use audio trace. The first thing I always do says to hear the graph, press H. So I'm gonna go ahead and press H. We'll hear sort of an audio summary of the whole graph.
Playing graph.
So if you've used the talking graphing calculator before, some of this will probably be familiar. The graph is represented by a pitch that changes over time, and the pitch gets higher when the curve gets higher. There's a couple other more subtle audio cues to look out for. So when the curve is negative, you'll hear a little bit of static, and the tone changes when the X value goes from negative to positive. Some of these are kind of subtle, but they help to give you a sense of where you're oriented on the graph paper. I'm gonna go ahead and play this curve one more time and see if you can hear. It might be hard over the audio connection, but see if you can notice things like the static and the tone changing.
Playing graph.
I can also, if I want to hear some coordinates that are on the curve, use arrow keys to move the trace point along the curve. So I'm going to press the right arrow key.
X 0.2, Y 0.2.
So it's telling us the point 0.2, 0.2 is on the curve. And I can press and hold down the key to hear some tones as the trace point moves, and then stop and I'll hear another coordinate.
X 0.4, X 3.6, Y 3.6, X 3.8, Y 3.8.
So you can navigate the curve with arrows and hear points that way. You can also navigate between points of interest using tab or shift tab. So I'm gonna press shift tab. There's like one special point on this particular curve that we'll hear when I press shift tab.
0, intersect at X 0, Y 0.
And so let me try making a curve that's slightly more complex, and we'll see a couple other points of interest.
Expression 1, Y equals X has superscript 2, baseline 1. Y equals X superscript 2, baseline -1 has graph. To audio trace, press Option plus T.
All right. So I'm gonna audio trace this. Before I audio trace it, maybe think in your head what you think it might sound like.
Audio trace on. Use arrow keys to navigate. To hear the graph, press H to disable audio trace. Press Option plus T. Expression 1 intercept. External med X.
All right.
Playing graph.
So we heard the pitch go down, come back up. And so for this curve, it has several points of interest. So if I use tab, I can move through all of them.
0 at X, -1, Y 0.
So we heard there's a 0. We can hear where the minimum and the y-intercept are.
Intercept, external med X 0, Y -1. 0 at X 1, Y 0.
And another 0. So again, there's like a lot more we could say about audio trace. I know folks are at all different levels of math, so I don't want to go too deep into the details of graphing stuff. So I think I'll pause here and again just ask if there's any questions about
From US to system dialog. Mute. How
audio
do
trace.
you
Okay,
change
sorry, I'm
voiceover
going to
off?
turn voiceover off for a moment.
We have a question on how to change the X and Y scale.
Yeah, so there's a couple ways to do this. So there's buttons on the graphing calculator for zooming in and out. And all of this stuff I can navigate with my keyboard too. So I can either press tab to move between the different buttons on the screen, or like when I'm in my screen reader, I can use shortcut keys to move around. I'll talk about where to find those shortcut keys, or I can just search for things like zoom. So we can press a zoom button to zoom out. Also up in the settings menu, where I turned on projector mode at the beginning, we'll also have these Braille modes, same as the scientific calculator. And if you want to put in really specific values for the X or Y axis, like say we want the Y axis to go from, I don't know, -10 to 50, we can put that in there. More questions?
Back in that settings where you were setting your X and Y minimums and you were choosing step, the value you might choose to enter for step there, that would be how much it jumps over when you use the right arrow in audio trace?
No, I think the value it jumps when you use right arrow and audio trace just depends on what the bounds of the graph paper are. So what step is it's like how the graph paper is labeled. So if I put in a step of like 5 here, then I'll see more grid lines. I also saw a question, how do you see a table? So let's go ahead and put, well, there's a couple ways to do this. So I'm gonna get back over to the expression list here. So one way is, actually let's do this first. There's an add expression button here that allows me to add several different kinds of things. So expression is like the default thing that we wrote, where you can either write an equation or just a function of X. We can put in a note, table, folder, image. So let's try putting in a table. So we can put in values of coordinates manually into a table like this. Or if you have an expression you've already written, sorry, that was too fast. There's a button that's called like the edit list button. It switches into a different mode that gives you a couple extra ways of manipulating expressions. So we'll go into edit list mode. And then we can turn an expression into a table with this button, or duplicate or delete. So I'm gonna go ahead and convert this expression to a table. So now we've got a table with the same x squared minus 1, and we can see a few values on that table and also a plot of the curve. More questions?
Yeah, is that easy to access as a blind person? I mean, you were showing us it all visually.
I think, yeah, I think it's reasonably easy to access. I didn't have my screen reader on there. Maybe I should have, but as I was doing that, I was doing it completely from my keyboard, actually, using tab and shift tab to move around. And so maybe this is a good point to pause and talk about shortcut keys too, because that's going to be like, if you want to become an expert user of the calculator with a screen reader, that's going to make it a lot faster to do some common things. So I'm going to go to help and then keyboard shortcuts. There's quite a lot of them here. So if you want to get used to this at some point, you can sit down and take a look at what's available. One interesting thing here, so the list of all the symbols you can write, and this was something that Sarah brought up earlier. So for square root, we can type SQRT. And for summation notation, for example, if you just type sum, we will give you the visual sum notation that you can type into, and similar things for superscripts and subscripts and all the notations the calculator supports. And there's shortcut keys for moving around the expression list, for using audio trace. Graphs can have interactive points. There's a lot of stuff in here. I won't talk about all of it today, but for students who are like maybe more interested in math and graphing, learning some of these shortcut keys will let them become expert users of the calculator and move as quickly as they can think. Craig asks if sliders are accessible to the screen reader. So yes.
Voiceover on.
So
Open graph CMD.
So I'm going to make a graph that has a slider, and so I'll write y equals ax.
-2 equals a x. Add slider for a.
So I wrote y equals ax. The calculator notices that a is a variable that's not defined yet. And so it's telling me it can make a slider for A. And I'll just press the enter key.
Expression 5. Desmos graphing calculator.
And
Application.
so that made a new expression that's a slider. And I can do a couple things with this slider.
Expression hide
So-
expression, expression 4. A.
I can either just edit it directly as an expression. I can also set
Slider minimum.
lower and upper bounds and a step for it.
Slide 10. Selected.
But the main thing to do with sliders is you can either for visual users, drag this slider thumb around with a mouse, or I've focused it and I am going to move it with the keyboard.
2.
So as I'm changing the value of the slider, the curve will change, and then we could hop over into audio trace and hear what effect that has on the curve.
Hide expression. Expression 3. Y equals AX has audio trace on. Use arrow keys to navigate. To hear the graph, press.
All right. So then we could hop back into audio trace and hear this curve.
Susan Osterhaus to everyone. Voiceover off.
Oh, sorry. I was trying to answer somebody in chat. I was trying
Yeah,
to be
no,
quiet.
that's totally fine. My screen reader sometimes says more than I wanted to. So one other thing I wanted to show briefly here, let's just zoom us back to the initial appearance.
Voiceover on.
So once we made a graph,
Open graph, CMD plus O, and 1 more item, and 2 more items, and voiceover off.
sorry. Once we've made a graph that we're interested in sharing with someone, there's share features up here. So this made a link I can send, so I could send this to my teacher. They could look at the graph I made. We can also like print or export image. So this is going to let us export a visual image, but we have a couple special ways of drawing the graphs that are appropriate for tactile graphics embossers. So far, we have good support for 2 common embossers. One of them is the VP Max. So I can select, and this will make an image that I can just drag onto my desktop, print to my VP Max, and the image has changed all of the labels to Braille, drawn the curves in a darker way than the background. So the VP Max is able to print dots at different dot heights. So this is set up to be able to feel the difference between the grid lines and the curves. So this is a really cool option, I think, if you have either a VP Max or Romeo or Juliet tactile graphics embossers. We're interested in supporting more of them. We've experimented a little bit with other embossers, and if this is something that you're really interested in, we can reach out to us because we'd like to talk more about it. One other option I wanted to mention, just because it's new and I think has some interesting accessibility implications. So you can download either a PNG image, or the new thing is download a SVG image. SVGs are cool because you can edit them in other software to adapt them to whatever you need. I think they work well with things like 3D printers. I'm excited about using SVGs for tactile graphics in the future. You can already try it out today, but I think there's a little more we might want to do with Braille for SVG. But anyway, tactile graphics, you can produce them with the graphing calculator, and something we're actively working on. I hope the options will get even better over time. Any
Jason,
questions about tactile graphics?
I have a question. This is Sarah Moore. When you're talking about making the graphs tactile, I guess maybe it's more for other teachers. Do you have a set plan in place so that you have the tactile graphs made before you give them the equations? Or do you try to do them as you make them? Because my students might want to see this as we make it as well, and get that connection between the line is going up or down and the curve and things, the maximum, you know. How are other teachers, I guess, showing that tactile part along with the graph on the Desmos for the Braille students?
Does anyone else want to field that?
was just going to say, Craig, have you been doing something like that? If you'll have to unmute yourself though.
I haven't had an opportunity to be able to like get that live feedback tactually. I know we had worked on it in the LRC. Me and Sue we kind of did what he was just saying. We did an image on Desmos and then we embossed it on the embosser. And I mean, it happened within seconds. So I mean, whatever you put on Desmos, you can emboss it really quickly if you have the embosser right there. But there is like I haven't found any way to be able to do live feedback, like as you type it, being able to feel it tactually.
Yeah, I was going to say years ago, I had a different system, and actually had a Tiger embosser in my room. So we were able, to do that with that particular technology. And it was the audio graphing calculator from View Plus. So of course it worked very well together because it was the same company. So just to let you know, I don't know whether everybody is able to have that kind of setup, but I was able to have that. I actually had the Tiger right there in the room, and so the students could graph what they wanted and send it immediately to the Tiger and go over and take it off.
Yeah, mine is not, I don't have one in my room. We have a Juliet down the hall.
Well, I think it was like the second one off the, second one they ever made. So back in those days, people didn't know, they didn't know what I had right away. So once word got out, then everybody wanted to use it and get more and so forth.
We've had students use it with the Romeo 60, but it seems like a lot of them just do the audio for speed's sake and just rely on that more. But when it's something that they want more information, then they'll emboss it at that time through the Romeo.
Yeah, one thing I would like to just kind of interject is that there are devices that are slowly but surely coming to fruition that can do multi-line Braille at various resolutions. One is the Graffiti from Orbit Research, which they don't list a price on their website, which tells you how expensive it's probably going to be. So I don't think we're at the point where something like that's going to be in every classroom, but I think at some future date, it's entirely possible that you can have one of these refreshable graphics displays connected to the computer and, just make a graph on Desmos, and you'll be able to feel the change immediately when it happens. I mean, we prototyped it. We were able to borrow one of those devices for a while and it worked. So for, instant tactile feedback, that's probably the most realistic solution. Unfortunately, I don't know how far away that is from happening.
Thank you for that, Stephen, because yes, well, Sarah, you have one too. We some of us have prototypes of the Graffiti. And so it's nice to know, because I was able to like hook up the Orion TI-84 Plus to it and get instant feedback. So it's nice to know we can do it also with Desmos.
Yeah,
and
I was able to get it on the Desmos too.
And the kids were just like wowed. So, but they are, well, right now you can't even buy them. And well, I guess you can buy them, but they're very, in fact, I have a meeting with them in a few days, but Orbit Research, that is. But anyway, yeah, it's getting the price down and so forth to where people can afford one.
So I want to take a moment quickly to address a question that Craig raised in the chat, which is how do you run a regression? So for the curve to data, we're coming up on an hour, so I don't want to get into too much detail on this, but instead I just want to show that there's a couple of tours up here that are really useful from the help button, and one of them is about regressions. So if you go to help regressions, this will guide you through the process of making a regression to fit a curve to data. One other resource that's really nice to know about is learn.desmos.com. I'll go ahead and paste that in the chat too. This is a great place to find tutorials about using the calculators or Desmos's classroom activities. So Graphing Calculator has links to lots of interesting graphing topics, some calculus things, how to use lists and parametric equations and regressions. And so this is a really nice place to learn a little more about what's possible. We have a question, sorry. Would the students send the graph to the embosser by Bluetooth? Yeah, or USB. I've always hooked up the embosser that we have at the office by USB, but same deal, really. Our embosser, well, it works pretty much only with Windows, but then it acts like any other printer. So you hook it up with USB and choose it from like file print from the image. Are you sonifying parametric equations or polar? No, not right now. There's some interesting ideas about how to do that in a way that's intuitive for people that we've experimented a little with, but we haven't come up with anything that seems like it's really, I don't know, obviously great. And so we're still scratching our head a little bit about polar and parametric equations for audio trace. Desmos calculators for standardized tests. Yeah, this is an interesting one. Let me,
yes, Jason, that was a big question that everybody had. I know you talked to Sarah and me about it, but I think the group would like to hear what you told us about those.
Yeah, so let me again start from our homepage here, and down in resources, like next to our accessibility documentation, there's information about testing. I'm pretty excited about the story we have to tell here. Desmos is now incorporated into standardized assessments in like 30 states, maybe, more of them than not. And so we have a map here of all the states that Desmos is built into the software that delivers state standardized tests. And if you choose one of these states, we give a little information about which calculators are available depending on the grade level, and a link to a PDF giving some more information about the exact testing environment. And Desmos is also now incorporated into some national tests, International Baccalaureate, NWEA's MAP tests. People ask us a lot about ACT and SAT. So we've been in discussions with both of those organizations. There's some pilots of delivering those exams digitally that include the Desmos calculators. Most students still take those exams on paper and can't use Desmos on those yet, but that's something we're working on and making progress on. A couple more questions from the chat. Can you graph vectors? There's nothing for graphing vectors like built in, but you can use parametric equations to draw pointed arrows. So like if you just Google Desmos vector, there's some interesting example graphs. Question from Sue. I've used the graphing calculator before, but I know there are so many other lessons you can do on Desmos. Are the scientific and graphing calculators the only part of Desmos that are accessible? Yeah, another great question. Thank you for this. So there's a whole nother part of the Desmos world that I didn't talk about too much today, teacher.desmos.com, which has activities for classrooms to run all together. So I can't get into the details of teacher.desmos.com today, but one thing I wanted to point out, so you can search for activities on different topics. And I think if you type screen reader in here, oops, maybe it needs to be 2 words. This will bring up a whole list of activities that we've edited specifically to be screen reader friendly. We think they'll work well with a screen reader. I want all of our activities to be good with screen readers, but some things are hard to represent that way. It's something that we're actively working on. Anyway, if you go to an activity, look for the screen reader friendly badge. That means that we've edited the activity with screen readers in mind, and we think it can be a good experience. we're coming up on an hour. I would love to keep talking with y'all, but I think we should respect people's time. So I think we should probably wrap it up here. Susan, any final comments you want to make?
I think you covered, the biggies, and I was going to say these folks should speak up or forever hold their peace kind of thing, but I'm not. I'm thinking like maybe we could do this again, sometime in the future, after they've worked with Desmos a little more and so forth. We'll keep in touch with you for sure. Any hopes we got something did more things just come into the chat or not? Or just thank yous? Okay.
I left a quick link to accessibility@desmos.com is the email that Steve and I and Jenny, who's our designer, who's worked a lot on accessibility. All three of us read that. That's the fastest place to get your accessibility questions answered. So please reach out to us there. Again, really happy to see some familiar faces here and some new faces. We'd love to hear more from everyone about their experiences using Desmos in their classrooms. So thank you so much for your time. I'm interested in setting up maybe a regular webinar series. We're talking about that internally. So I will, I guess maybe Susan knows how to get in touch with folks. So if we get that working, I will reach out to Ontario and Susan and I'll let you know where we can do something like this again. Really fun. Thanks so much, everyone, for your time.
Thank you very
Thanks,
much.
Jason. We really
All right. Well, I guess, let's see. Well, I'm just checking. I think there's just a bunch of thank yous. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Yep, lots of thank yous. And Jason, if you'll just send me the link too, so that for those people who had to run out or couldn't get here, they definitely want the recording. So just let me know. Okay.
I'll let you know as soon as it's ready. It'll probably take me a few days. So expect me to get back to you sometime next week.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.